Ooh, sorry about that. And we'll be looking at the present and future impacts on the French case. That said, our research lead, Emma, will take it on from here.
Thanks, Danny, for this introduction, and good morning, everyone. Let me just share my screen. Sorry about that, it always takes. Okay, can everyone see my screen correctly? Okay, amazing. Welcome, everyone. I'm happy today to present to you our research on EU refugee migration policy, looking more specifically onto the French case, and also looking at the current situation and the potential future impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. I was lucky to work with an incredible team. Suthida, Kevin, Hector, Nupur, Ben, and Hillary will be presenting with me today our research. Quite surprisingly, I want to start with the acknowledgement. So first of all, of course, thanks to my team for their time, for their energy, and their idea. It was amazing to learn from them and to see them develop as well. Thanks to BBI, and more especially to Dani for her support and kindness along this journey. And of course, thanks to the peer reviewers who gave us very insightful advices and who helped them improve a lot our research. I'll just start by introducing our paper that has three main components. We first look into the current political framework surrounding immigration in the EU. So looking at the policy in the last years, and more specifically as well on the new pact on migration and asylum, and seeing, looking at how this new policy could bring some very important change. We then dive into the French case and look on two aspects, both how immigration influenced the current political climate, but as well how economic integration has a major role to play in the migration policy context. We are bringing some critique and policy recommendation before looking at whether or not the nationalist claim is going to prevail, or if we can hope for a positive integration following the COVID-19 crisis. So that's our third part, which is the cross-historical vision, where we look at past crises and study the both economic, political, and social disruption caused by COVID.
So for methodology, we have consulted both primary sources and secondary sources to aid our analysis. So for primary statistical data on refugee demographics by the Eurostat, as well as the official documents by the French government and EU are used to understand the socio-economic impacts of the EU and France migration policy. And secondary data were also used to draw links between the existing literature and the research question. In the second half of our paper, we focus on a cross-historical analysis to make projections on the COVID-19 impacts on refugee immigration. We drew evidence from the existing journals about policymaking and voters' attitude. Meanwhile, historical sources were also found to compare the COVID-19 pandemic to past crises. So moving forward on our main research findings. First, I'm going to talk about the background of political framework surrounding immigration of the EU. So our main inspiration for this part of our research is to see why EU still collapsed despite having common refugee policies. So indeed, in the 2015 EU migration crisis, over 1.2 million people applied for asylum in the EU, which is the largest flow of migrants since World War II. The immigration is triggered by refugees fleeing from conflicts from their home countries in the Middle East, Africa, and East Europe. And as seen by the map on the slide, most immigrants follow the Eastern and Central Mediterranean routes. And it is important to take note that most refugees, in fact, over 75% of the asylum, applied for only 5 out of the 28 EU boundary for them member states, which will be elaborated in the future slides.
So here we have a brief overview of the evolution of EU common refugee policy before, throughout, and after the crisis of 2015, starting with the Dublin III regulation of 2013 and ending with the new Pact on Migration and Asylum of 2020. The question of why the EU failed to develop a coordinated European response to the crisis rests on policy, on structural policy failure of the agreements in place, namely in the Dublin III regulations, which were the status quo in 2013, placed a significant socioeconomic burden on the frontline countries such as Italy, Greece, Hungary, and Bulgaria. Next slide, please. The Dublin regulations required migrants to apply for asylum only in the first country of arrival, and therefore these countries experienced a significant surge in right-wing anti-immigrant sentiments among the population, who felt overwhelmed by the increase in numbers of migrants. Conversely, non-border states, specifically Northern Europe, did not help address the crisis directly, even though we think they should have been required to do so by policy. Similarly, the early policy response of 2015 and 2016 was very weak. National states failed to comply with their expected quotas of migrants to return to origin countries, and the general social discourse surrounding refugee protection was treated as a zero-sum game and focused mainly on outsourcing responsibility. A clear example of this is the EU-Turkey statement of 2016, which brought in a non-EU third party, Turkey, to help the European Union deal with increasing numbers of migrants through the Eastern Mediterranean route. This further contributed to the image of refugees as a burden rather than a resource, and to the rise in populist anti-immigrant narratives all over Europe, and specifically, as we will talk about later, in France. As I mentioned, the latest development is the new Pact on Migration and Asylum, which offers some hope because it appears to be a major shift in policy. It consists of a coordinated common European response and includes mechanisms of concrete solidarity to border states in times of crisis, as well as a plan for the integration of refugees in society. However, the favorable political conditions in the European Parliament and the European Commission that made this pact possible are not enough to ensure its effectiveness. Non-compliance of national governments, especially in times of extreme crisis, is still very likely, especially in the absence of efficient and clear enforcement mechanisms on the part of the European Union. Thus, we believe that until such mechanisms are put in place, the effectiveness of European cooperation on refugee policy and crisis remains to be limited.
Thank you, Benedetta. So now that we have a lot of information from our previous presenters, I would like to sum that up, that we have now two major sources of information. The first one being that 1.2 million people applied for asylum to Europe in the year 2015. And the second one, that 9 attacks in the major states of European Union, out of which 3 were in France since the year 2015. So it is in this context that we contextualize. Can we have the click, Emma? That we contextualize the migration in the EU. This helps us to break out the two essential breaking points leading to the shift in the migration policy landscape of the European Union. That is the influx of migrants from the Middle East and the increase in the number of terror attacks. The next slide, please. So, okay, now we answer the following questions to understand the two essential breaking points. The first one being why there is movement of people. So the movement of people is because of education, the career opportunities, And in the recent times, we have seen the war in the countries like Syria, Yemen, have made people to move to other countries. Can I have the another click? Yeah. So why Europe is the hotspot for the asylum seekers? This is because of the proximity of European zone to the warhead zones and also to the underdeveloped countries. But then, even after having these crystal clear answers, why there is hesitancy towards migration and migrants, it is in this context that we pick up the case study of France. So yeah, why migration hesitancy? This is because of the huge cost to the national citizens in terms of clothing, food, shelter, and space. Secondly, the fear of terrorism, especially after the terror attacks in the year 2015. And lastly, the fear of erosion of the European values due to the Islamic influence. Now, my friend Hector will take you further to the French case and the influence of migration on the French politics.
Thanks, Nupur. So good afternoon, everyone. We look at immigration as a social, cultural, and political phenomenon, and how it has impacted and will continue to impact the French body politic. So in general, we have seen several trends which show immigration's divisive effects. First is political polarization. This is an erosion of moderate opinion on immigration. Trends such as supreme French nationalism, xenophobia, and migrant-induced fear showcase a general redshift towards right-wing opinion. The talisman of this trend is Marine Le Pen and her party Rassemblement National. This is a self-proposed national rally which unites its voter base through anti-immigrant messaging and specifically anti-Muslimism. So in general, we can say that immigration is hugely consequential in terms of domestic political attitudes, and governments must thus tailor their mandates in response. So let's take a closer look at some of the key facets to this issue. Le Pen amassed popularity in the 2017 presidential election in France, where she won 21.3% of the vote in the first round, which was the second highest score amongst 11 candidates. This saw her through to a contest vis-a-vis Macron, who eventually won the election. So a few things to know here. We can surmise that the European refugee crisis actually helped Le Pen. She took advantage of national anxieties towards terrorism and stressed the financial, social, and political burden of hosting refugees. Also, Macron's victory was a result of less popular centrist candidates endorsing him instead of opting for the more extreme Le Pen. So many centrist candidates had nondescript manifestos, and what worked for Le Pen was that none of these candidates had solid stances on immigration, nor were they prepared for the attention that immigration as a debate topic would receive. So as said, polarization is prevalent within French society. So here are a few key polls, and the sources have been cited in my section of the paper. So we have 63% in favor of medical welfare care to refugees being abandoned completely. We have 74% in favor of establishment of immigration quotas, and we only have 36% who think Macron is doing a good job in handling the immigration crisis. So after establishing all this, the second half of my paper looks at the effects on policy that we have already seen and potential policy directions in future. So immigration has forced the incumbent government to take tougher stances on refugees. We have seen the reduction of access to non-urgent healthcare for refugees. We have seen the introduction of the crime of solidarity reform. This is a murky legal concept which penalizes French citizens, helping migrants access French citizenship. We've also seen the government launching campaigns to attract skilled workers, and this highlights the political tightrope that Macron is trying to navigate. So in other words, he's trying to appeal to both ideological camps in his new policies and policy reforms. And by the way, the refugees themselves are increasingly disenfranchised with France. Polarization continues to contribute to a sense of unwantedness. So Le Pen is now the voice of the opposition, and while she doesn't wield decision-making powers, her rhetoric and popularity in France it pressures Macron to cede certain moderate stances to more right-wing pleas. Le Pen's momentum is certainly high, and it's high enough to carry her to the 2022 election. So it's unpredictable what the result might be, but if she is successful in growing her support base, then she is expected to do better than her 2017 efforts. And to wrap up, judged of recent policy shifts and polls, we can reasonably state that immigration will continue to engulf national debate in France. In fact, Le Pen's popularity could accelerate this trend so long as Macron is seen as insufficient in his handling of the immigration crisis. And lastly, the two major junctures have contributed to this crisis, and these are the European refugee crisis and the French domestic crisis, specifically the rise of right-wing politics. Thanks.
So beyond social politics, understanding the political economy pillar also helps us to explore what policies need to be in place to protect and help integrate vulnerable persons. In the case of France, a policy change in 2019 reduced the country's employment ban to 6 months. While this means asylum seekers might be better able to become financially independent, displaced persons face other forms of discrimination in relation to economic integration. This include employment restriction, a negative perception of locals towards asylum seekers, the lack of language skills, inadequate standardizations across international education credentials to recognize previous skills, and the uncertainty of asylum application outcomes. These factors lead to a widened skills gap that depreciates human capital and put further pressure on the French government to provide welfare. To combat this, policies exist at various levels to increase the rate of economic integration. At the national level, next slide please, the Republican Integration Contract includes a maximum of 400 hours language training for learners to reach A1 level French, a 24-hour civic orientation course, and provides information on how refugees can access public services such as education, housing, and healthcare. At the regional level, the HOPE project provides French language education and work placements through public-private partnerships that pair language course with a professional training contracts. And finally, at the institutional level, From Refugees, Pardon My French, runs the Accelerone program that provides tailored support for up to 2 years to help refugees fully integrate into French society. Nonetheless, existing French refugee integration policies fail to respond to the evolving market demands for higher level education and vocational skills. To secure employment, an elementary level of French isn't enough and should be supplemented with business level French as well as additional training for digital skills. Based on the latest EU Action Plan on Integration and Inclusion, governments also need to work on standardization processes to validate previous learning credentials, and there needs to be better coordination across the country to provide ongoing, localized support for resettlement. So as the country moves into COVID recovery, attention will return to the national economy as the engine of inclusive growth. The next session goes on to explore what a history of crisis can reveal about a post-pandemic future.
So now the icing on the cake. This is the cross-historical comparison that we did, and we were trying to gather all that. As we explained, we narrowed down our focus, European Union, the French case, and then we brought it again our vision to see whether we could draw some inferences from the past and if we could learn something from crisis. So basically, we did a comparison between existing literature and the ongoing developments, especially considering the pandemic. So we took a look at financial crisis and the economic, political, and social disruption caused by COVID-19. And we took into account financial crises because they are directly linked to what's happening. In fact, our crisis is definitely financial, but it's also political, socioeconomic, and we wanted to take a holistic view into this issue. So all the sources that we got, for example, the International Organization for Migration, which supplied us with the data, European attitudes towards migration, a behavioral consideration, but also migration and mobility after the 2020 pandemic. So trying to foresee what's happening in the future. And this paper was dated April 2020, so we have more information now also to verify whether it is true or not those predictions are happening or not. And so in terms of what the literature finds, what we found in the literature, slide please. So thanks to the literature review, we find, first of all, that access to national soil is prevented from migrant receiving states to forcibly displace people. And there are constraints on the opportunity for migrants to access national soil because of the harshness of policy after crisis. So, for example, in financial crisis in the past, oil crisis or the 2008 crisis, states prevented migrants from accessing by pursuing more restricting policies, and the same happened with COVID, not because it was targeting migrants specifically, but because, of course, of the health implications. Second of all, there's a behavioral change in how people react to migrants after a crisis, and all the focus is kind of how nationals can get access to funds and how foreigners are not entitled to receive any benefit. And this is a proved behavioral change that we find in the literature. And third of all, we have the disruption of migrants' well-being when there are crises, especially with the COVID pandemic. We know, for example, the BAME groups are more likely to get hit by the pandemic, but at the same time, forcibly displaced people are dramatically hit. So next slide with the recommendations that we found.
So we consider it's very important to look at the short-term vision. Refugees are a very vulnerable category that are impacted as everyone, if not more, by the current pandemic. And so we are considering how an inclusive recovery from COVID-19 could help the refugees. Of course, that is a short-term vision, but it's also a longer integration as well. But if we stay on the short-term aspect, on the question of vaccines, these people have usually medical antecedents, which make them more vulnerable. It's also very important to consider the stimulus packages and how we can keep a share of them for the refugees. And that is something which would help them on the short term, but that could also envision the longer term, which Kevin is going to as well extend on.
I've been drawing for the previous section's analysis from Sustida's analysis about the political economy aspect of the French case and how those issues could be tackled. We drew some, we gathered all the information we had to make some recommendations, and for the long-term vision, we tried to think in terms of smart policies, so specific, achievable, relevant, and a policy that could be pursued by the government, feasible policies. So first of all, the securitization of the secondary job market. What's the secondary job market? It's basically where it's manual jobs, and it's not the market of services where most people work. It's that kind of industry which was mostly affected by COVID because of the closure of everything, and it was not. There were no benefits, no unemployment benefits, no kind of just so that people in that market were kind of safeguarded. So definitely securing that kind of a market, and it could help, first of all, for possibly displaced people, definitely, but also for the market in general, because it keeps a solid economy in general, and it's definitely helpful at the aggregate level. Second of all, a sustained support for those already in, so investing in human capital of these people. And as we said in the previous section, there's a kind of a skill gap, right? And we need to train these people. Also, language is the first thing, but also education to increase their productivity and make them inclusively part of the system, of the economic system, so as to benefit both that situation and the economy in general. And third of all, probably most importantly, which something that can make things easy, the distribution of the poverty burden, not letting other just single countries like Italy, Malta, Greece deal with the crisis. And how will we do that? Because we always talk about how cooperation is important, but it never happens. It's about decreasing the incomplete information gap, meaning that agencies or international bodies in the European Union, at least, we're talking about regional cooperation now, have the relevant information, and a network of information is essential in that it allows agencies to act quickly, tackle the issue at stake by knowing what's going on, and to allow action at the level. So these are our recommendations.